My dear Masala Podcast fans, I've written a book called Bad Daughter. You surprised by the title? I think not. I've never shared such deeply personal things before. I talk about growing up in poverty. I talk about my father's violence, my mother's murder. I talk about how I turned my pain into power, navigating mental health, sexuality, spirituality, and patriarchy. Bad Daughter is my story of going from Mumbai's slums to New York's billboards. But it's your story too. What's the message of this book? It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what happened to you. You still get to have the life that you want. If you're looking for a book to move you and inspire you to change your life, type in Bad Daughter by Sangeeta Pillai on Amazon or go to my website, baddaughter.co.uk.
All I know is that the idea of closing down something like grief, I think deeply problematic and really unhealthy. And I think our society lends itself to closing it down, to like getting it over and done with, to fix it to a particular time. And then if you don't do that, then you're aberrant. You're an aberrant, or they medicalize you, and it's completely wrong. And I think we just need to find other ways and other language to think about how we stay healthy with trauma and grief included.
Besharam, badtameez, chi, gandhi, chal hat, toba, oho, bad beti.
I'm Sangeeta Pillai, and this is the Masala Podcast, a Spotify original. This award-winning feminist podcast for and by South Asian women is all about cultural taboos, sex, sexuality, periods, mental health, menopause, nipple hair, shame, and many more taboos. Join me around my virtual kitchen table as I talk with some inspiring women from around the world, exploring what it means to be a South Asian feminist today. I interviewed Mona Arshi for Masala Podcast, and gosh, it was the most nourishing and positive conversation on grief. It's difficult to imagine that talking about grief can be uplifting, but it truly was. We circled around language, loss, love, and grief, of course. I've been a huge fan of Mona's work for years. Before she started writing poetry, Mona worked as a human rights lawyer at Liberty. Her poems and interviews have been published in The Times, The Guardian, Granta, Times of India, as well as the London Underground. Mona's debut novel, Somebody Loves You, is out now and I'm sure will win hearts and awards. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it.
I've always read and loved poetry. It's been a really important part of my life. And even when I was a human rights lawyer, I kind of needed it. I just felt very seen in it, and I felt less lonely when I read it. And then I had my daughters, my twins, and I literally had quite an unstable pregnancy, and I had to stay in bed for quite a long time. And someone sent me a box of poems and books, actually, and I hadn't kind of touched contemporary poetry for a long time, and suddenly I was re-encountering language in a different way. And I think it was something about what was happening to me as a pregnant woman, and the drama of the body, and then the drama of like the language, and there was an intersection between those two things, and I just couldn't believe that. I think I said to someone at the time, I couldn't believe it was legal. You could actually read, this is legal, it's available to consume. And so, so I loved it. And I started going on lots of courses and just to really just read more poetry. And then, bit by bit, I started writing it. And then I did a master's at University of East Anglia. And then I published a book and, another book and then a novel. So I kind of don't think I I never thought I'd end up in the situation where most of my day is occupied with words and language, but that's where I am.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I was thinking about words, and I was thinking about how sometimes even the most powerful words can't contain the emotions we sometimes have. And when I was reading that piece you wrote for the Yale Review, you talk about being on a train to Norwich, was it?
Yes, yeah.
And then you heard this really difficult news. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So just to say, this was in March 2012, and it's a day I'll never forget. But there were lots of things happening. I was studying for my master's at the University of East Anglia. I was going on a train journey to see my tutor with some poems in my bag, and I just got a phone call from a coroner. Initially, I thought it wasn't for me because I couldn't quite process the words. But effectively, I was told my younger brother, had died, and very suddenly, and I got off that train, and then I had to return back to London to relay that news to my mother, who was weirdly enough looking after one of my twins who wasn't very well, and so I guess the reason why that moment is quite important, and I suppose I keep going back to it in my writing and my thinking and my ideas, was that I think I met that moment at the same time that I was thinking about what language was doing, because I was writing as a poet. I just started as a poet, and I had to, at a very early stage of my writing career, think about what language could contain. And actually what you talked about this, what's not containable, what's ineffable. And I realised that sometimes language fails us. I mean, dramatically, constantly, violently. And that's what I discovered when I was in those moments of grief. And I've also discovered that actually there are spaces and forms that allow you to be able to find the language. And obviously there are poets that have written for centuries, ancient poets and prayer, that have been able to hold that and illuminate something for us in that work.
Absolutely. And I think something else that struck me was about what is the language that one can use when conveying grief. You mentioned about going back home to your mum, and you didn't know whether to talk to her in your kind of adopted language of English or her language, Punjabi. And again, that really struck me, because I find like some words I cannot translate into English. They just don't have that. And I find that conversation around grief and our languages of grief really interesting.
So do I. And I think that that what was really curious to me was the fact that actually English is an acquired language for me. I didn't know a word of English until I was 5 or 6 years old and I was at school. Before that, I was calling a bucket balti, and that was the language I was used to. But of course now I speak, I write, and I think in English. But when I was confronted with the language of grief at that moment, it was strange, because it was curious to me how I was having this real tussle with what language to use. I think that my Punjabi, which is part of my body really, I think it was a primal language that was passed on to me. The first words that I ever learned were Punjabi. That was having a tussle with my English, and it was really difficult to explain. But lots of things are difficult to explain when you're in the throes of grief. And I recognise that, actually. I recognise the fact that there was this kind of strange limbo where I wasn't quite sure. I was very unmoored in language. That in the end I had to relay that news to my mother in the language, I think both languages in the end, and they were the most painful words I've ever had to speak, to tell my mother, to use the language and to tell her that her son had died. But I'm sort of also kind of like intellectually curious, as well as obviously suffering the pain of it. I'm also intellectually curious about what was happening with language, and actually when I wrote the piece for the Yale Review, I was also interested in what language is available, because actually what was really strange to me was that there was no language, there is no word in the English language for somebody that has lost their their child. And given the fact that many people lose their child, there is no word for it. There is in Sanskrit. There's a word. There's a vilama. That's a word, and the word widow and widow are also from Sanskrit, which is really interesting. And actually, even those words, when you look at them, they're so, the sonic properties of them, they carry a mournful quality. That O.
Even vilom sounds really mournful, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the vowel, the O, it's so sad.
Yeah.
So, I found it in Sanskrit, weirdly enough. But why is there no language?
Yeah.
I feel like there's such a paucity of language for being able to encapsulate something that is so common.
Yes, absolutely. So many of those things you said there really touch the core of me, because it feels like so many times I've felt emotions that then I haven't had the words to put to. And again, what you said about our languages, like I've grown up, like you, I grew up speaking Hindi and Malayalam at home and then went to school and started learning English. So that's very much an adopted language. But now I write and I think in English. But when I wake up in the middle of a nightmare, it's Hindi. Like I say Hindi. It's so bizarre. So that's clearly coded within me.
Yes.
And I don't know if you feel this. I sometimes feel a sense of loss from those kind of my original language. I feel like I've lost it somewhere.
Yes.
I don't speak the language of my mother, for example, Malayalam. She's no more, but she used to kind of recite poetry in it, but I have no access to any of it. So it's almost like by adopting this more Western, more accessible language, I've lost the language of my ancestors. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Absolutely. I feel that acutely too, because Punjabi is a language now that is lost to me. And I feel like this sense of bereavement for that, actually. It was really weird because last year I was really lucky. I was a writer in residence in a bird sanctuary in Cley in Norfolk, and one of my jobs was to write into this space, and I felt very odd and strange in this space because it wasn't familiar to me. The countryside is not something I'm familiar with anyway. I decided I want to syllabize the birds, and actually a lot of the poems came out in this language of Punjabi, which was really interesting because I think that's a subconscious hearing something. I mean, it's interesting because when you hear something that doesn't make sense, and of course birdsong makes no sense syntactically or at all, of course, but when you start thinking about trying to work out what it might say, it's interesting how you might hear something that might be in the body as opposed to something that you're trying to intellectualize. Yeah. So there's some poems actually that are just Punjabi words, nonsensical, but they're trying to make sense of that, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. And also I read somewhere that language is the more rational part of our brain does language. So sometimes when the feelings are so primal, we can't access language. It's almost like they're two different circuits, I believe.
Yeah.
So which explains sometimes how we can't find the words. Literally, we can't find the words.
Yeah. I feel that acutely all the time. And sometimes, I mean, it was interesting when you were talking about loss of language. I mean, I can't identify at all what it is that I'm feeling. Yes. I just feel that there is this sense and I can't.
Yes.
And I think that's down to the fact that we, as immigrant children, lose our kind of mother tongue, for want of a better word or term, quite early.
Yes.
I think I lost my language, my Punjabi. I think probably by the time I was 10, it was all gone. I remember I went to India when I was 6, and apparently I was chattering away in Punjabi to my aunts and uncles and cousins. And then I went again when I was 20 and it had gone.
And there is loss.
Yeah, how sad is that? Not being able to communicate
sad.
Other than really kind of basic ways, with your grandparent,
Yeah. And I get that basic communication. I'm the same with Malayalam. It's very basic. I can't explain anything more complex than I would like a meal or, very perfunctory kind of language. Yes. And I'm I have all this stuff inside me that I can't put into this language that I was born into. So I completely get it.
Why is it that sometimes we are at a loss for words in certain languages? There are some feelings that I just cannot express in English. Whatever it is that I'm trying to say, either the intensity of the emotion or even the taste of a particular beloved food, it feels too big for my adopted language. There are certain jokes in Hindi or Malayalam that just do not translate. And in the same way, some words in English convey feelings that are only specific to English. Isn't that interesting? And then, sometimes there are no words, none at all, in any language. There are times when my feelings feel too much, too painful, too massive, and then the words feel so inadequate, tiny, useless. For me, language has always felt incredibly beautiful. But recently, I've learned to get comfortable with sitting without language, without words.
Let's talk a little bit about grief and poetry and how one has helped the other for you, like your journey within that.
I mean, I guess when I was writing, so I was kind of confronted at a very early stage with having to write this is what we do, poets. One of the important things about a poet is we attend to things. And I felt very much in language, and I felt very much that this big thing had happened in the middle of me writing starting to write as a poet. And I had a sort of argument with language, as we discussed, and then I realized that actually one of the obligations or responsibilities I had as somebody who was a poet was to attend to the grief, the big grief in language. And I think that means, telling the truth and listening acutely to what is happening to the body, to people around me, and to the experience actually. And I wouldn't say that it was cathartic, because often people say that, it must have been very cathartic for you. I just think I didn't see it like that. I just saw that I just have an obligation to do it and a duty to attend to my brother in death. That's how I felt about it. And actually a byproduct of that, I hope, has been that it's been useful for other people, and people can use the language and use the poems to step into, and they might, it's a mirror to ourselves. We're all going to suffer big griefs. Yes. And these big traumas in our life. And actually, I think poetry can sort of help you feel less alone in those experiences.
Absolutely. I think you can almost find your own grief within the poetry, I think. Like when I read some things, and prose as well. And sometimes I'm like, okay, yes, the thing I couldn't say, someone else has said.
Yeah.
And there is comfort in that, I think.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about grief in South Asian culture.
Yeah.
In our culture, I feel like we are more connected to death and grief. It's closer to us than within kind of Western culture, where it feels quite removed. Like just experiences, I've kind of been to friends' funerals, and the whole kind of the funerals I've been to, the person's body is kind of in a casket. You never see it. It's really far away. And it feels like the opposite in South Asian culture. Like it's just there. It's in front of you. So you've got no choice but to deal with it. Now, I found that a little bit too brutal, particularly with my mother's death. It was there and I couldn't really process the trauma. I wonder if you had any thoughts about how South Asian culture looks at grief, and also about how we communicate with each other within our community about grief. Like, have you thought about this at all?
I have. I mean, my experience is really, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that, only because my experiences of grieving have been really particular to like one big grief, which is relating to my brother. But I have observed it, and I have found that what's very interesting is that there is definitely this idea of, I think, linearity and circularity, which I sort of am interested in anyway, in terms of how we kind of in Western culture tend to sort of see grieving. And I've read a lot of bereavement literature, and none of it, apart from maybe two books, which I'll mention. One of it is by Joan Didion, which is a wonderful book about the death of her husband, and then another book by Denise Riley, which is about the death of her son, which talk differently about the progress of grief. But I think that there seems to be a much more circular way of dealing with grief, I think, in South Asian communities. I think there's a willingness to sort of see it as not so much a trajectory or kind of a process. Although you process there's a body that's being processed. I think that in terms of talking about the dead, it is very, very different in terms of how we don't close it off as much, I think.
Yeah.
But then there are other people, my experience has been that, in relation to my brother, for example, many, many people turned up at our house, mostly women. They just basically, these wise women that had been bereaved before, that had something etched on their face, actually, that I realise the bereaved have. They come into their houses, they took over the kitchen, they fed my children when we were incapable of, even putting food in our mouths. And they took care of things. They took those, and I just think that is something that I was so moved by, actually, just like this care, this attentiveness, and also they just weren't intrusive. They were just sort of doing things, and they were just making sure that we were getting up in the morning and being fed, and we didn't have to think about those things. Those things that happen to you when you're grieving, which are just so physical. The physical aspects you just can't deal with. And which is what was so surprising about being bereaved. There is something that's happening to your body. It's like a cognitive violence to your body. And yet, I don't know, perhaps it should have been obvious to me that was what grieving was, that it was so physical as it was.
Yeah.
But I guess those things, unless you know, I feel like there's an innocence. You kind of lose your innocence.
Yes.
And a friend of mine actually said she'd lost both her parents quite close together, had said to me, you just feel like you're suddenly assigned to this room, the room of the losing your innocence room, where you've lost your innocence and you never get it back, you just know. But all these women, I just really felt like very little was said, but so much was offered, and given.
Yeah. And it's almost like, it's an awful thing to say, but there is the section of the population that hasn't experienced grief, and then there is the section that has. And there is a difference in the way they are physically, emotionally. I don't know, there's a difference, and I can't even again find the words to say what that is. And when you have an intense kind of emotional conversation with somebody, you can tell. And it's almost like those who've not lost anybody, they don't have that.
Yes.
And then those who've lost somebody, they have that. It's such a simplistic way to say it, but there is a difference, and it's a stark difference, I find.
I think it's this kind of armour.
Yes.
It's like you lose there's this slight emotional armour that you lose all of a sudden. You never really get that back.
Yeah.
It's a fragile kind of film that we carry, and that leaves us. And actually, I don't know, it's really odd actually to say this, because it's such a difficult thing. It's such a difficult grief to have lost someone young in our family and so suddenly. But I also feel like, there are things about the grief that have illuminated things for me. They've made me change the way I think about life. There's the other end of that. And I find I struggle with this a little bit because, of course, I'm writing into this grief and I'm trying to be useful and write things. And yet a lot of people have mentioned that the poetry that's come out is really beautiful. And I don't know what to do with that, because actually you realise that the byproduct are things like beauty.
Yes.
And you have to sort of resolve that. There is a guilt with that,
yes,
attendant to that. But
yes,
those are things that have happened as a result of this terrible event that I wouldn't wish on anyone and wish had never happened to me. But equally, I think it changes you irrevocably. And I don't know, it's a bit like illness. I've been reading quite a lot of essays around illness and how people talk about illness. Actually, we're all going to be ill at some point, but actually pain and illness, how they give you like a different lens to look through. And I suppose the poet's lens on grief is slightly skewed by their experience. And, this is where I've landed anyway.
It's almost like grief allows us to access a deeper part of ourselves that we weren't able to before. And like you're saying, it's complicated because it's not, because a big grief has happened and a big loss has happened, and that's really hard. But then it somehow takes you to a deeper place within yourself that you didn't even know you had. I was thinking about grief in South Asian culture and specific communities. And I don't know if you've heard of the Rudalis in Rajasthan.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember there was a whole film in
Yeah.
Bollywood. I think I watched. I don't remember the
Yeah.
film, but I remember the women, and the dark eyes and the dark clothing. And I thought it was quite beautiful. Like there's a whole community who are professional mourners, like a Rudali. It just translates into mourning, crying. I think Rudali. I think from what I remember. And they just turn up. It's a whole group of women that just turn up to your house when you lose somebody, and they express and they cry and they wail and they beat their chests. But I think the point is that sometimes we are frozen by grief and we're not able to express the sorrow, and they do it for us. And I thought that was somehow very beautiful and poetic and sad at the same time.
Yes, yeah. I mean, again, it's the performance of
Yes.
it. It's the performance
Yes.
of the grief and the mourning. These women are not connected with the deceased person, but yet they could perform what we cannot perform, which is so, if you think about it, so strange. But also, I think lots of cultures, I think you can actually hire mourners, can't you?
Wow, I didn't know
yeah,
that.
I think you can hire mourners if you're worried about attendance, for example. I think I'm sure that you can hire mourners for
I did not
funerals
know
and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think it sort of, there's something else about that actually that is interesting, which is ritual and grieving. And what's interesting is about in South Asian culture, we so associate, for example, widows with white.
Yes.
And widows' behaviour is really policed
Yes.
in our
Yes.
culture. And I remember that very, very starkly with a neighbour of ours whose husband had died, and I definitely think there was this expectation of, is she doing it right?
Yeah.
Are the particular customs followed? Are the rituals followed?
Yeah.
And basically I don't even think she was that old. I think she was about 50.
Yeah.
But also I remember another incident where my mother's sister, my aunt in India, she lost her husband very young. Like she was only like in her 30s, and she had 4 daughters. Imagine that, a widow with 4 daughters in India in the 1970s. And again, it was just like, well, that was the end of your life.
Yes.
You know, you were just consigned to
Yes.
wearing white and forever the kind of the bereaved.
Yeah.
And there was a performance.
Yeah.
So that is curious to me.
Yeah.
But I also think there is something that you carry with you, particularly after the first few weeks of a death, where you feel as if you are so fragile. You're going out in the world, you're getting on trains and going to work and meeting people, and no one knows, only you know. And I think that, you know, I was thinking about this the other day when, you know, looking at the Yale piece, thinking there is something about, you know, when we used to wear black and we used to wear armbands, and I know no one does that anymore. But there is something about just signposting to the world where you are, that you need to be handled in a different way. You know, this idea of wearing black, and I know we've lost that now, but we've also lost this ability to know.
Yes, when
How-
someone is in mourning.
Or to just, you know, just
Yeah.
understand, or
Yeah.
just give them space, or give them a different sort of interaction, you know. So I don't know. I'm not saying that we should. I'm not advocating that we should all go back to wearing black. I just think there has to be, if we're going to have these kind of communities where we don't know what's happening to our neighbours, I think that maybe we should just think about other ways of ensuring that we can look after those people that are bereaved
Yes.
in some way.
I absolutely agree. And I think there isn't that in society now. So maybe we've left and I'm glad we've left the widows have to wear white and can't get married and have to shave their heads and all this stuff. And that's
Yeah.
awful. And I think it's a real shame that women were put through that in our culture. And
Yes.
it still carries on.
And men weren't.
And men weren't. Exactly. So
Yeah.
as a woman, your life was finished. Your husband's dead now. There's no purpose
Yes.
to you. So it just makes me really angry.
Or even, you know, your husband's dead and we're going to now put you on the fire.
Yes. Oh my
So-
God. Yes.
So
Sati,
that's
yes.
that's no. But I think that what it tells you is that these are deeply entrenched rituals
Yeah.
that come from. I mean, annihilating yourself, for example, basically saying to a woman who is widowed, well, that's the end of you. You are basically going to have a living death now,
Yeah.
because you're now invisibilized
Yeah.
in our society. You no longer speak.
Yeah.
You're on the periphery. You're on the margins. You're just whitened out.
Yeah.
That tells you something
Yeah.
about how brutal it can be.
Absolutely. And also they used to have all of these things. I don't know if that happens in Punjab, but certainly in a lot of the North India, that you wouldn't have a widow in any functions or marriages because she would bring bad luck.
Yeah.
I mean, how awful is that? Not only has this woman lost her husband and is being completely kind of obliterated by society, and then you're told that you're bad luck, so you're not allowed into any of these functions. It's just awful. I was thinking the other day that there were so many different kinds of griefs. There's I can't even imagine the grief of losing a child. Some of us have lost parents and siblings, and I've experienced a lot of grief for a childhood I never had. So I think I had to go back and really say, I'm really sad that childhood never happened. So I was just thinking out loud, how do we navigate these various kind of strands almost of grief in our lives? And we've all had some of it at one point or the other.
Well, we could start by thinking of language for what it is that we are grieving for, and accepting it once we've identified it. There's a really interesting quote by Jung where he says, "We may not want to engage with it, but nevertheless, it will engage with us." So you can run from it, but you can't hide from the. So I think it's important to understand that what we carry when we were younger, we carry in the body. Yes. You can ignore it. We can not confront it, or we can try and gently have a conversation with it, and understand how it might influence our decisions. I mean, most therapists will tell you this anyway. But I think it's important that we don't try and pretend that our memories are in little boxes, little hermetically sealed boxes, and they're over there, because I think that is a hiding to nothing. Because really, and this is the thing with grief actually, and with any kind of trauma and trauma memory, we are tripping over our trauma memories in particular all the time. They're like tripwires through the day. Often they kind of blindside us.
Yes.
So let's just accept that rather than pretending that they are sealed little, because they leak out, and they're so leaky, and we are sort of messy. We're not kind of computers.
Yes.
Even our griefs are messy. They upend us, and there's no particular trajectory. There's no one way of grieving. All I know is that the idea of closing down something like grief, I think deeply problematic and really unhealthy. And I think our society lends itself to closing it down, to like getting it over and done with, to fix it to a particular time. Yeah. And then if you don't do that, then you're aberrant. You're an aberrant, or they medicalize you, and, it's completely wrong. And I think we just need to find other ways and other language to think about how we stay healthy with trauma and grief included.
Absolutely. And I think what you just said there, which is society expects us to have this very neat kind of trajectory of grief where you get X number of days, weeks, months, whatever, to have various stages of grief. And then you're supposed to be done with it. And it's never that simple. Nobody I know who's experienced grief, for them it's that simple. It comes up, it leaks out, like I think you say so beautifully. I think we've got to change that expectation. I don't quite know how, though, within society, or what we can do.
I think we just have to have conversations, and we need to provoke and not accept what's handed down to us. South Asian women in particular, who are often reduced or troped or invisibilized anyway, I think we have to find ways of not accepting what's given, what the structures. And sometimes we just have to think about making our own language for things, and challenging, being curious, provoking, the whole and being completely active. I mean, and language is part of that, not accepting the language, thinking of other ways of thinking of different forms, actually, not accepted forms. There's lots of ways of telling stories. There's not just one way.
Do you find, and I've only say this because I found it myself, that sometimes when you introduce grief into a conversation, it gets very uncomfortable for people? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, there has to be safety in those conversations. I think that it's an uncomfortable thing for most people. This is the thing about grieving, we are made to feel like it's unusual, but actually it's commonplace.
Yes.
It's commonplace. And, we have been dying for like a long, long time.
Yes.
It's just
I love that.
but it's just how our society is unwilling to discuss it. And
Exactly.
I get it. There are certain forums where it's probably not birthday parties, maybe not, weddings.
It's a jolly occasion. I'm going to talk about grief.
But I think we don't talk about it nearly as much as we should. And actually, most people that you speak to will be recovering from something grief related or know somebody. It's
inescapable, isn't it?
It's inescapable.
It really is.
And so let's not try and pretend. I mean, it's not really our fault. I think our culture is such that we try to wrap things up in cling film and sweeten things up.
Yes.
Grief doesn't really fit in the agenda. It's not really Instagrammable, is it?
Grief isn't Instagrammable. I love that.
So I think that, but it's essential part of who we are. It's a texture of our humanity. We can not deal with it and not be equipped, or we can just start thinking about using a language that will help us to equip us and equip the people we know and love when it happens.
Yeah. I was thinking about what other people could do. So there's one is us kind of finding the words and using the language and talking about it. And that's been a huge struggle for me, because I think my first response, and it was a trauma response now thinking back, I just shut it down. I'm like, okay, if I don't access any of this, none of it is real. And obviously, it'll come out in a million ways, and it does, and it did. So that journey was to kind of get okay with being close to grief.
Yes.
Then finding the language for it within myself. And now I'm slowly starting to find the language to express it to other people, I think. But how can other people help anybody that's in a grief journey? What do you think they can do? And sometimes I think they can be quite hurtful without meaning to, because they don't really know. If you've not experienced it, you don't understand. What are the ways that they can help?
I mean, I think it's really simple. I just think that we should just use our imaginations. Our God-given imaginations can take us really far. So just a little comment, which is that I don't think people were being hurtful when my brother died, and people were coming to do absource and, support my family when, and visit my mum when my brother died. His name was Deepak, by the way. But I think people would say things like, I just cannot imagine what you're going through. It's unimaginable what is happening to you. And I just remember thinking, and this is what I wrote about a little bit, was that do you not want to imagine it? Because actually, how is that helping my mother to like saying, I've come to sit with you in your grief, but actually I can't actually imagine what you're going through, because what you've experienced is so out there, so out in another room, that I can't even imagine what it would be like.
Wow. And
I think that, again, it's not a criticism, because, these people are kind people. And actually, I've probably said those words as well. But I think that it tells you something about how unwilling we are to go to all four corners of our imagination, and actually how important the imagination is. Because actually, when we talk about empathy, what is empathy actually? Empathy is the use of it's the imaginative leap. That's what empathy actually essentially is. And so just trying to put yourself, it's like a really simple thing, trying to put yourself in that person's shoes and say, I can imagine it, and it would be awful if I imagined it. But to say, I cannot imagine it, because what you're experiencing is so out of the human realm.
Yes. Yes.
So is, I think, really not helpful. So just thinking about language, and actually I think that using your imagination anyway is helpful.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely. And also I think maybe what I found in my experience is allowing that person to sit with the grief, but not asking really, you want to know all the gory details. I've had that a few times. And, there was a newspaper article I was writing about my mother's death, and the editor's like, well, but tell me all the gory details. And I'm like, you have no idea what you're asking. That's awful. So I think sitting with somebody, giving them space to express, but not digging so much that it is extremely painful. Like,
yeah.
put yourself in their shoes. Like, would you really want to relive that?
I think that's such an important point, and one that I've been grappling a lot with, because so many people, obviously I lost my brother 10 years ago now, and I wrote about it like recently. So it's taken me 10 years to write about it, 10 years to talk about it with you, and I'm grateful I'm doing it. But it's taken me a long, long time, because I felt like all the questions I was being asked were actually not about what was my brother like, but actually the last moments of his death, in that last, the events of his few days or moments. And I just think that I think that's really deeply actually quite offensive, because you can't reduce a person to a few moments. And actually that's a desire in the person to know something gratuitous. And I feel like I don't want to do that to my brother's memory. And I think that it's also none of your fucking business.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't do it. And I just think I'd rather talk about, the things that made him, his humour, his love of cats, and, red wine, and, his beautiful, sensitive, vulnerable nature, those things. And I think that turning up actually to the house of the bereaved, and just holding someone's hand and just saying, just tell me about, let's look at some photographs, or tell me about them, I think is enough. Turning up and doing that is enough.
I think, and that itself is a huge amount, I think, where again a lot of people feel very uncomfortable and they're not sure, I think, what to say or what to do. But I think what I'd always say is just turn up, and what you're saying, like, just let's sit and talk about the beautiful moments of this person's life. And too few people do that, I think.
Yeah.
And which is a real shame, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think also you're in such a vulnerable position when you're bereaved and you're sitting with I think those questions. I mean, I remember my mother being asked those questions, and I was constantly having to guard her and ensure that she was protected from them a bit, really.
I used to think of grief as something just related to death. But having thought about this incredibly difficult emotion so much, I realized that grief is so much more than that. There are so many shades, so many layers to grief. Of course, the grief of losing someone we hold dear. Then there is the grief of losing a part of ourselves. I sometimes miss the more carefree, giggly version of myself that I used to be a few years ago. Then there is the grief around the concept of home. Moving from India to the UK 17 years ago means that I no longer recognize the India that I go back to. But I have also started seeing grief differently. I used to think of grief as this awful thing that you had to go through. But now I think of it as something that gently marks the passing of time, of people, of places that are no longer part of me. And that grief is okay.
I was also thinking about death and grief and what that teaches us about life. I feel like my mother's death, while it was incredibly, incredibly difficult, made me really think about what I wanted my life to be. And I feel like death can show us the beauty of life. It's incredibly painful. I don't say this lightly, but I think it shows us the way forward as well.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different. I think that how we carry it, how we deal with it, how it changes us, whether or not, many people actually are paralyzed after a bereavement for many
was I.
many years.
Yeah,
it causes so much psychological damage, and it's very difficult to, when you're in this sort of stasis, you can't move on.
Yeah.
I still feel, I agree with you. I think that in a way it's an opportunity. It's a vantage point to take perspective and to attend to the living, actually, and not to forget about the living, and trying to learn also there are things that you can learn, huge things that you can learn from being in that deep grief, for that, especially in that really weird time, when you're in that strange limbo, and you just have lost your footing almost, and it feels very strange, that strange limbo that people often talk about. Again, there's no name for that limbo. Just like there isn't a name for that time where you've notified of a death, and then you're waiting for the funeral. I mean, sometimes it can be just moments, like you said, but sometimes there can be no time. There could be like a week or longer sometimes, what that very, very strange time does to you in a strange way makes you look at the world in a very different way. And also time, things happen to time. Yes. Denise Riley talks about this, the poet Denise Riley, in her book, Time Lived Without Flow, where she talks about how time completely changes. Like this idea of time is thrown out of the window, this idea of the clock and time. Either it goes very, very quickly or it just seems to just slow down to nothing. I think that vantage point is a really useful way, I think, of thinking about, your relationships and the time we have left.
Let's talk about your book. Let's talk about your new book,
yes.
Which has been shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize,
yes.
I believe. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Tell me about the book and whatever else you're up to.
So I've got 2 books of poetry. Actually, they are sort of almost little like sibling books. And then I wrote a novel really completely by accident.
The accidental novelist.
I love that. I will take that as my title. So I finished it in lockdown, and it feels like a real lockdown novel. It's about a girl, South Asian girl, growing up. She's a teenager, and the main thing you need to know about her as a protagonist is that she doesn't talk. She can talk, she's a selective mute. And actually, a lot of the themes we've just been discussing are in that book around silence. What happens to language under the pressure of trauma? Really, it's like a curiosity trail for me. What happens to this girl who's in this has a very dysfunctional mother. She's in the weather of kind of like the trauma of her mother, who's sometimes functioning, sometimes not. A kind of pressurized suburban atmosphere. What happens to language? And I guess it's that journey, really, trying to discover what happens to her and what happens to language.
What's the name of the book?
Somebody Loves You.
So Somebody Loves You, which I've got a copy of. I still haven't read it, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. What else are you up to work-wise?
Well, I've written a lot the last few years, and so I'm off to Cambridge, Trinity for 2 years. And I'm really lucky. I've got a writer in residence position there. So
congratulations! That sounds
you.
really exciting.
Yeah, it's really exciting. You'll have to come and visit me.
I would love to.
Yeah, so I'm going to write. I'm going to do very little else. I think I just need to, because I've written a lot and I've been out a lot. I feel like now I need to go back into my cave, my writing cave, and be porous and read and just make things again. And so hopefully I'll be back 2 years' time with things.
With, I'm sure, a lot more amazing writing. Thank you so much, Mona. I feel like we've had the most incredible conversation. My mind feels really kind of calm, and I don't know. That's been a really, really lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
I'm Sangeeta Pillai. Thank you for listening to Masala Podcast, a Spotify original. Masala Podcast is part of my platform Soul Sutras. What's that all about? Soul Sutras is a network for South Asian women, a safe space to tell our stories, to hear inspiring South Asian women challenging patriarchy, a space to be exactly the people we want to be and still feel like we belong in our culture and our community, and ultimately a space where we feel less alone. I'd love to hear from you, so do get in touch via email at soulsutras.co.uk or go to my website soulsutras.co.uk. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Just look for Soul Sutras. Masala Podcast was created and presented by me, Sangeeta Pillai, produced by Anushka Tate, opening music by Sunny Robertson. बेशर्म, बदतमीज, गंदी,
Hi, hi, bad Betty.